Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Practice of Love podcast. I am one of your hosts, Lair and Ashley Torrent. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, the author of the book, The Practice of Love. I am a licensed therapist and speaker, and I am joined, as always, with my sweet, my lovely, my heart, my soul, my wife, Ashley, who is also a therapist, an intuitive medium, an all-around extraordinary gal. And today we're going to be talking about...
I never know what's going to come out of your mouth.
I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth. How would you know?
Who knows? Who knows? But we came back. Within 2 weeks.
Listen,
so we're back.
I'm just saying shit. Do you know?
Yes.
Today we are going to be talking about vulnerability in men. And it's been sort of top of mind for me. And I know that vulnerability is a big deal. Brene Brown's been talking about vulnerability for some time now. But we're going to talk about vulnerability in men. It's been up for me personally. It's been up for me professionally. And I've been seeing a lot of things with regard to male vulnerability, stepping into the male frame, how vulnerability plays into that. Does it play into that? I think it depends on who you ask. But in particular, I was on Instagram, as I am often, and I was watching this gentleman. I'm not exactly sure who he is. He was dressed like he was home on the range, cowboy dude, long beard. And he was talking about how men don't need to talk about their feelings. He was saying that they don't need to discuss it with anyone. They don't need to discuss it with a therapist. They certainly don't need to discuss it with their lady. They just kind of need to learn how to get over it. And that was alarming. And of course, I wrote in and commented something snide and scathing and a little funny, which a lot of people thought I got a lot of likes. I'm not going to lie to you. But I've also been seeing a lot of these boot camps for men. Where you'll have some former Navy SEAL running a 4 or 5 day boot camp where you're going to pay $15,000 and they're going to yell at you, humiliate you, and then call you a brother and give you a t-shirt at the end of it. And this is all sort of in service to, I think we're kind of lost as men. I think we're lost. We don't understand emotion. Typically, I'm painting with a broad brush stroke, and I can speak for all men because I am one. But I think we are kind of lost with regard to emotionality, vulnerability, what women want, what they don't want, what they need, where does that land? And so today we're going to take a poke at perusing this topic.
I love this topic. I think it's really important. And I remember you showing me that reel and the guy saying, you don't need to know what we're going through. You don't need to know what he's going through. You just need to know and respect that he's going through it. Right? It was very strange. It was like as if there was some sort of award or status in holding all this stuff that he's processing or holding for the family. But he didn't need to talk about it. You just need to respect that it's taking a toll on him.
Yeah, that he's going through his quiet burden quietly.
Right.
And we've not seen alcoholism, drug abuse, fooling around. None of that's been a byproduct of burying your fucking feelings.
No.
Was it Freud said it?
Cancer, disease.
Yeah, there you go. That
heart attack.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I always say women's ability to process their emotions, and there are some studies that now support exactly what it is that I'm saying. A women's ability to process their emotions tend to make them live longer than men. Mm-hmm. This guy was spouting off about how we don't need to, and he was sort of hearkening back to it. I thought it was an antiquated earlier time for men that I was hoping we had, emotionally and spiritually grown beyond, but I don't know that we actually have. I think we may be regressing, and it's scary for me. I'm seeing vestiges of it in my client base, and I'm certainly seeing vestiges of it out in the world, where men are sort of walking around not understanding exactly what it is they're supposed to do with these things we call feelings.
Well, that's what I'm seeing, is that where we've hit this point, I feel like we were coming to a pivotal point, and this often happens when change or healing could possibly happen, but it feels like a big swing to the other direction, like an overcompensation. And even from women, as men are, as you know, we're asking more of them, like the Me Too movement and all of it is asking them to check themselves, to be more aware and all of it. And then there's these other group of women who are like, just like all on men, like about they're not supposed to be emotional. They're finding it unattractive, like all these weird requirements of men. And I think it must be like, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Like, so what I thought would be important is like, first of all, like, let's talk about what emotional vulnerability is
Hmm.
for a man. I mean, we could talk about it for everyone, but specifically to men, what do you feel like emotional vulnerability looks like?
Yeah, this is such a big question. I think it's your ability to be authentic and truthful about how it is you're actually feeling.
Hmm.
Look, we are not responsible for how things, people, experiences make us feel. We're responsible for how we react to it. And, I think that the expression of our feelings is something that we wrestle with. I like to say that we have a very, very narrow window of emotionality with respect to male emotion. And this is when we probably get people writing in saying, cue your male fragility. And to that, I say, fuck off. Because we do have a bit of fragility. We don't know our ass from a hole in the ground with respect to how we're supposed to process our feelings, because societally we have not been shown by our fathers and our fathers before them to how to process our emotions. As Brene Brown tells this story that I always screw up. I was telling the story on John Kim's podcast yesterday, and I think I fucked it up, but I'll tell this time here anyway.
Nice name drop, by the way.
I know. Look at what I did, because I was on that.
Hi, John. If you watch,
he's not watching us. So Brene Brown was at a book signing, and this woman comes up. She's got 4 books, one for herself and one for her each of her 3 daughters. And she gets the book signed and she walks away, and she's with some man who's clearly Brene thinks that's obviously her husband. And they're having some sort of back and forth. And the man, you hear him say, no, I'm going to say something. And he walks past his wife and goes up to Brene Brown and says, so I noticed you don't write a lot about men. Mm-hmm. And she's like, I don't. I write about women. And he goes, well, that's convenient, because we have shame too. Mm-hmm. And I have 3 women in my house that would just as soon watch me die upon my white horse than watch me fall off. Mm-hmm. Do you know?
That story gets me every time.
That's true. Mm-hmm. That's how it feels. And, it's like we have this window of emotionality. If we go above the top pane, if you will, of that window, we end up in rage. We end up in doing and saying things we have to apologize for later. We end up being the pariahs of our culture, of our society, of our family. If we go below the bottom pane of that window, we end up where I just was, where you're feeling something that even in that moment, I wanted to choke back how it was I was feeling, right? Because it was the truth. And when we go below that bottom pane, we're worried that we're going to not be masculine. We're not going to be sexy. This is one of my rather crass clients said, this is where the pussification starts.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Geez.
Yeah. It's an awful term, right? But like, that's awful. The term he used. It's awful, but it's descriptive. Because that's his fear, that's how I'll be seen, that this is where the ick factor kicks in. Mm-hmm. And so, I've been particularly emotive and truthful, honest, and authentic about my feelings and my emotions over the course of the past, what is it now? How many years has it been? 23?
Yeah.
How have you dealt with that? How is that still sexy? How is that okay?
Well, first of all, I don't know why it's not sexy. You know what I mean? Like, that doesn't make sense to me. Like,
Okay.
why someone being emotional isn't sexy. And I've watched you over the years. Like, I always know when you're hitting that pain, that bottom pain, like
Mhm.
sometimes your instinct is to take a sip of water, to do something to
Block it.
stop the flow. Like,
Yeah.
and I've even said, "Why did you do that?"
And
And
I hate it when you
sometimes
do that.
I know, and you said, "Why don't you just let me be?" And I'm like, but that's me saying, like, I'm here for it. I'm totally here for it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Like, I think it's beautiful. And what I notice is when we're watching a movie and there's an emotional moment, my kids aren't watching me. Sometimes they look at you first to see how you're reacting, and
It's
then they'll look
crazy.
at me second. They're always looking at you. And there's a moment where they go complete, their bodies go silent when they
They
see
go,
you have tears in your eyes.
yeah,
And it's like their breath is like caught. Like they're aware that you're moving through something. And I love that you don't hide it. But and they need that model. They need to know, like,
this is okay.
this is okay. This is okay. So it's really beautiful. But when we were talking about this topic, I don't understand. Like, I don't understand. And I will be honest, the only time I'm a little uneasy when you show an emotion is if it's fear. Because to me, you're always this like big, strong guy who in our experience, like there's so many things that you can navigate. I grew up with a father who was not strong, who was very afraid, who I
Mhm.
saw as a coward, and you've always had this strength. And when you become afraid, like I've noticed and I've gotten so much better, but it used to be like, oh my god, if he's afraid, then
Mhm.
shit's about to hit the fan. But what I've learned, when you finally admitted that you had trauma,
Mm.
don't tell anybody,
I had to admit it to
because for a
myself
long
first.
time.
Okay.
What'd you say?
I didn't, I was such an idiot. I was like, trauma. I don't have trauma. Maybe you. You guys do. All of you have trauma. I'm good.
Seriously, like I knew you had trauma, but you weren't really you weren't no, not weren't really. You weren't admitting it for years. So
No.
I didn't see a lot of this fear that as you've gone deeper with yourself and come to understand your trauma, you've started expressing more of your fear. And I
Mhm.
have to admit, it's taken me a moment to kind of reorient to like, oh, he gets to be afraid. And that doesn't mean the world's falling apart. Like I can be the strongest person in the room when he's afraid. Because
Right.
for so long, I was the most afraid person in the room.
Right.
Right.
Mhm.
So I want to be honest about that. That was an emotion that I had to learn to hold in a bigger way. And
Mhm.
now when you become afraid, like I'll notice I was like, ooh, and then I go, he's allowed to be afraid. Like, of
Mhm.
course he's afraid. This is
Mhm.
unsettling.
Mhm.
And then I can hold the ground. I can hold myself and I can hold space for you.
Right.
I don't know if I answered your question.
I'm not sure you did, but I liked what you said.
Oh, well, you said, "Well, how does it make me feel?" And I
I
said,
said,
"I
well,
loved it."
how have you dealt with it? Like, how has that been for you over the course of the? Because I've been quite emotive.
Um, I love it. I
Mhm.
think I need emotional honesty and authenticity. When there
Mhm.
is not that emotional connection, I just kind of like there's nothing there for me. That's how I thrive. I thrive on conversations. I thrive on going deeper. I don't want you to hold all that stuff to yourself. I want to know.
Mhm.
Like that kind of clarity and depth and openness is like it's like food for a relationship.
Mhm.
It doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
Yeah, like when you get sad, it doesn't bother me.
Well,
I want to hear more.
well, as you say that, and you've been my rock all these years, because you have created that space, that overly used term that container we say in therapy, right? You have created that space where I could sew up my wounds,
Mm,
and that has brought me closer to you. You
mm,
know, I'm not ashamed of the feelings that I've expressed. Uh, you've held them so exquisitely, and you've given me that space. And because I'm not ashamed of them, because of probably because of the way you've held it, and said it's okay for you to dip below that line. I'm still gonna find you sexy. How could you not? Um,
exactly. And
and
what does emotional expression have to do with sexuality? I don't understand. Like that just doesn't make sense
I
to
think
me.
it makes people feel like they're soft. It's the ick factor that they talked about in that show, that they're soft, they're not manly. They're not staying in their masculine frame.
I'm
And I'm not.
sorry, someone who's emotionally intelligent and expressive is the sexiest to me.
Mm,
Like, that is sexy. That's what has always made you sexy. From our first conversation, you dipped below the surface and asked me questions and shared pieces of yourself. And I was like, it was like oxygen to me that I'd been
mm,
looking for.
mhm,
You know, it's something that's always made me attracted to you, is your willingness to go there, to connect
mhm.
from the heart.
Yeah.
Grew up with emotionally unavailable men. There is nothing sexy about a macho, emotionally unavailable man
Mhm,
to
mhm.
me.
Yeah.
And I know you get projected on a lot, that you're probably just a little macho and like tough and everything, and you're probably not
Wh-
soft, but you're a
What was
teddy
that?
bear.
What was that one we had that we? I'm not outing anybody. We were drawing some tarot cards or something, and someone who had never met me before, except for that day, someone that you knew, she drew a card, and then she started talking about the feminine, and she immediately said, "Well, first of all, there's nothing feminine about you," which I
Right?
thought
You
was
get a
an
lot of
interest.
that.
I get a lot of that projection.
Mhm.
Um, and so when we talk about like masculine frame, I think there needs to be a defining of what does the masculine frame mean, because I think that when we start to look at redefining it, people get really panicky, like, oh, you're going to ask me to, and you hear things like, if, find your feminine, and that's going to create a lot of problems for men, a lot of men. I'm sorry, I just think that most men are going to be like, okay, tell me when it's over. I'm
Right.
not doing that. And
Right.
so I want to kind of blow that idea up,
Mhm.
that you don't have to, like, whatever that means for you. That's not what that means.
Right. That's
That's not
exactly. It
right.
doesn't mean you're gonna
No,
like.
you just become more of a holistic human being when you're able to tap into those more to some of those softer, more vulnerable, more open-hearted feelings, right? And so it's not about, like, finding your divine feminine or whatever that fear creates in someone. It's about touching into feelings that go beyond knuckle dragging ape, that are authentic, true, and open hearted. Do you know?
Mhm. Yep. Well, what's interesting about you drawing tarot cards is that's you being in your feminine.
Yeah, a
You
little
know,
bit.
intuition is feminine energy, like you tapping
Hmm.
into that. That's an example of you being in your masculine and your feminine.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, why do you feel that you get that projection? How are you participating in that maybe?
Well, it's a question I don't want to answer. Um,
But I think it would be important.
I think I've got a lot of beat up little kids inside of me,
Mhm.
you know, um, and I'm by no means saying, that I look, my mom was 15 years old. It was abject poverty, and I grew up in neighborhoods that I didn't look like everybody else, and so I got the shit kicked out of me a lot,
Mhm.
um, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, uh, and and so that puts a chip on your shoulder. And so it's funny because it's like I feel more at home with black folks often, with gay folks, people who have been marginalized, but I'm not wearing the cloak of marginalization. I look like the white guy who probably fucked you up. And, and so there's this sense of, like, I kind of always feel like I'm caught behind enemy lines wearing the wrong uniform.
Mhm.
And I certainly don't mean this to be a woe is me story, but there's this sort of duality that I experience no matter where I'm at. If I'm in a room full of, wealthy white people, I feel like the kid from the wrong side of the tracks. Do you know? And if I'm in a room full of marginalized folks, I might feel a little bit more at home, but I don't look or, present the way that maybe I should to fit in better. So I don't really feel like I fit in anywhere. And so what I think has happened is I've created this protective aspect of myself that vibes people. Do you
Mhm.
know? Like,
Mhm.
I'm not going to put my dukes down first, because that has historically not gone well, as you've
Right.
witnessed for yourself. You yourself, we won't even go into those stories, but you yourself have witnessed that and said, "What are you talking about? You're such an amazing guy. You're so sweet. You're so kind." I'm like, "Watch." And sure enough, you're like,
Oh,
"Holy shit."
the minute you show up open-hearted,
Hmm.
and this is an example. Like, I've seen you literally kicked in the nuts. the minute you
Literally
were
kicked in
kind
the
to
nuts
somebody.
when
And
I
I
was kind to them.
remember what?
Literally kicked in the nuts.
Literally kicked in the nuts. I've seen you over and over again been treated pretty terribly when you
Mhm.
showed any sort of like softness or emotional vulnerability
Yep.
in friendships and relationships, especially when you're meeting people. And I
Mhm.
remember we went on our first date, and I think it was our first date that you said to me, but you were wearing boots. And I asked you, why do you always wear boots when you go out? And what did you say?
Because you don't know when the shit's going to go down.
Right.
Yeah. You've got to have you got to have good shoes on in case there's a fight.
Yeah, you weren't going to wear any soft shoes so that they flipped off your feet if you got in a fight. You had steel-toed boots that you
That's
wore.
right. That's right.
Yeah, like you just started wearing like sneakers
Mhm.
um maybe 5 years ago.
Right. And so I don't want to get too far off topic and make this a therapy session for me, but
Well, no, but my point being is that this is about vulnerability, right? And
mhm.
like you're an example of like the protective layer or coating that you've
Yes.
created to enter different spaces, but what's underneath that and what I get to see is this really beautiful side of you. And
Mhm.
so what we're trying to figure out is like, how do you navigate those spaces without maybe having to have a protective coating? Or how do we help men feel more comfortable being vulnerable? Like, how do we welcome and accept that aspect or that part of them?
Well, I mean, I think it's two separate conversations. It's let's say, okay, we're talking about men being vulnerable in relationships. Um, that's a particular space. Hopefully you're with a person who can accept that and not see it as a weakness, but do what you've done over the course of the years, which is to invite it in, to celebrate it. Um, you know, being vulnerable that way with other men, I mean, that can be a turd in the punch bowl, right? Like that's not necessarily what other men are expecting or necessarily want. Um,
Mhm.
and so when you get in groups of men, that's off. It's not part of the conversation necessarily. And
Mhm.
there is often the opportunity to be made fun of. It may be one on one if someone's really going through something, perhaps.
Mhm.
Um, but by and large, I think it's about changing. It's about changing the culture, I guess, and saying that it's okay, finding ways to show people that it's okay. Um, what's the upside?
Mhm. The upside of vulnerability?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I think there's so many. There's something that occurred to me before this, but I'm going to go back to it. I think the upside is you'll be healthier. Um, you'll be more connected if you find the right people. Oh, what I was going to say is like maybe if you allow yourself to be vulnerable, then you really weed out in your life like who you can connect to and who you can't, and your
I think
world
that's
might
right.
get smaller.
I think that's
But if
right.
you're in a relationship that your vulnerability is not welcome,
That's right.
then that's information. And I was going to say is like, so what is your responsibility as men if you're willing to go there? Then it might be that you have to look around at the groups you're choosing to be around or the people in your life
Well,
and like,
that's the answer,
yeah.
and that's been my answer. Is
Mhm.
that I'm no longer willing to make room for or give mulligans to people who aren't willing to be at least authentic. Let's
Mhm.
call it authenticity, because I think within authenticity there's a big part of that is being vulnerable, because vulnerability is the truth. Truth is authenticity. And so I'm bored now with people
Mhm.
who are inauthentic and who can't find that space of honesty, which often plays like vulnerability.
Mhm.
Um, it's not interesting to me. It's a big fucking ego stroke. And so I get bored very, very quickly. And I think that I did that early enough in my relationships with women where it was like, if you can't accept the fact, because I was raised by women, I'm way more comfortable being in that space around women. And it's easier because they tend to be more accepting by and large. Um, but yeah, with respect to all relationships across the board, my world, to your point, has gotten a lot smaller, because I don't give a shit about the fucking football game. I don't care. How's your marriage? How's your
Mhm.
kids? What's going
Yeah.
on in your heart? Are you living your best life? Like, so it doesn't have to be you're sobbing on the floor and I'm mopping you up. It could just be the truth about like, yeah, like, my life's not going great. Like my job kind of blows. Like this isn't what I thought it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Having kids is really hard sometimes. Like those types of conversations, those are the ones that really interest me. And I'll have friends of mine who'll say, oh, I know you're a therapist. I don't want you to work. It's like, I really don't have, I don't have any interest in talking about your fantasy football team. I just don't. There's nothing there for me to get to know or understand about you in that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was adamant in my romantic relationships that I would not accept a lack of depth or someone's willingness to hold space for my own. And I remember that early on, I was with this woman. I think I was like in my 20s, early 20s, and had been with her for a time. You know who she is. And I had been reading a bunch of like self-help books, and I was really taking a deep dive, and my mind was getting blown. And there's a inherently vulnerability in those conversations around what you're feeling at depth and what you want to get into. And like, whoa, this is my spirit. This is my soul. And I remember her saying to me, well, does it always have to be this complicated? Does it have to be, can it just be what it is? And it was sort of disparaging in the delivery around like I was making life and thought and feelings way harder. She was saying that your vulnerability around this is not welcome.
Right.
And I knew in that moment, I was like, this relationship has got to be over.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't hold that. You don't want to hold that. You're not interested in yourself and the vulnerability that lives within you. And you're certainly not interested in within me.
Mm-hmm.
So I went looking for you.
Well, I so appreciate it. I don't know. Like I said, it's like a breath of fresh air. I don't know. And I feel like as partners, it's our responsibility to be curious, to be open and curious and notice, like, if we're not welcoming this. Yeah.
Isn't
like,
that
what's
it?
wrong? Like to notice, like, okay, why is this bothering me? What is it about this?
And for me to be curious about what's bothering you, right? This is, I think, people often want to know, like, hey, what's your secret, Lair and Ash? How have you been able to keep it fresh and sexy and fun and connective over the course of 23 years? We've always laughed that the reason we started the podcast is we just started recording the conversations we would have around coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Those cups of coffee, those conversations around coffee were all about vulnerability on both sides, and both of our, not only our willingness to hold it, but get interested in what that is for the other person. And that has been the connective tissue, I think, over the years. This has made your willingness to be vulnerable on every level. This has made you that ever evolving puzzle, that person that's never not interesting. There's always something coming out of your mind. This morning, holy shit. Like, okay, I never know when my life's taking a fucking hard left.
What came out of me this morning? I don't even.
Oh, just, the new book idea. The new book.
Oh my God, the downloads. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just sitting there going, oh, okay. Because, we were never horse people. Now we're horse people. We have, yeah. So yeah, those conversations that are laden in vulnerability on both sides, that is what I think is the marrow.
Well, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You're touching on something that I think is really beautiful, is like, it's not just about vulnerability, isn't just about like expressing sadness or expressing fear.
Yeah.
It's also about expressing your dreams. Like for me to sit there and receive that download and then share it with you and watch you processing it, like that could have been a very vulnerable moment, but I'm like so safe with you. I'm like, yeah, I know you're wrapping your head around what I'm saying, but you share your dreams with me. Like you share your ideas and your dreams, and you let me read the stuff that you write. And like, to me, that's vulnerable. Like
it is
like
vulnerable.
Sharing with me these parts of you, those parts of your heart. Like it would break my heart if you had to keep that hidden or tucked away. As going back to that reel, if I knew that you were toiling over some sort of creativity or like, I don't know, whatever this guy was talking about, and it was like some burden you were processing, but not to be able to share it with you, then what kind of life is that? Seems very dry and like brittle. But also there was this weird thing about that reel. There was just like this thing of like, this egoic thing of like holding this massive familial burden. It was just like, that's not sexy to me.
No,
It's like,
and
get over yourself.
it's interesting to me, as I've worked with some veterans over the years, and you look at it, there is a massive amount of vulnerability that I think ends up being infused into the relationships men have who have served together.
Mm.
Like, I think just by the very nature of what they've had to go through together,
Mm-hmm.
that vulnerability smacks them in the face, and they're met with that, and then you have this connection to these other men that you've never experienced in your life. And
Mm-hmm.
so they will call each other brother. They will come home and long for the connection that they had with that guy in the foxhole or in that experience, and they can't find it here, and
Right.
it becomes disheartening. And no one's saying to these guys, hey, a version of that could be described as vulnerability. Like, there is an inherent vulnerability that you had to be taken to, that you had to experience in that experience. And so, of course, when you come home and no one's doing anything even remotely like vulnerability as far as male relationships are concerned, um, they have a hard time finding it. And then there's this existential experience, this deficit of, I will never find that type of connection to another person again. And I think that throws
Mm.
people to depression. Um, yeah, I just thought,
It's so isolating. But you know what's
yeah,
sad about that?
mhm,
That they have to go, and I've heard this about firefighters and police officers as
that's right,
well,
that's
that
right,
they have to go through these dangerous life and death situations to
that's right.
create that kind of brotherhood. What would it be like if
Yes,
we saw life, because life is challenging. What if we could find that sort of connection in life? Like that's the one place that they're pushed to a point that they're to rely on each other, that they're not just like isolated. That's
mhm.
so heartbreaking to me.
It
Like,
is.
what have we done to men that they can't turn to the one next to them and just see like a familiarity in the other?
That's right. Well, and I get to experience it because I think the safest place in the world for me is being a therapist, besides being with you guys. Um, because people come to me, I'm their last ditch effort,
Mm.
right? And this is that place where it's okay. It's green light. It's a green light to be in vulnerability. And so, it's like that work for me it's incredibly personal. Obviously, it's incredibly rewarding to sit and be with men who have come to this place. But it's usually, you know, their relationship is in the ICU, or they're being fired from their job, or there's a divorce. It's usually when everything's coming apart and there's some version of that life-threatening scenario being presented within their lives that is beckoned them to this place of vulnerability where they actually ask another man for help. Holy shit.
Mhm.
One point I want to make around, it's also in sports. Like, in sports, men can hug each other, and if we've won something, then we can be emotional about it. And I see this a good bit because you watch weird YouTube shit. Like, I see, you know, Junior's first home run in the big leagues, right? Or this quarterback threw his first touchdown, and then they always pan up to the parents, right? The parents are in the audience, and they always look at dad,
Mm.
right? And the dad, like, is wiping his eyes, and he's trying to not, he's holding it back, and the announcers don't know what to do with it. And so they just say things like, "Oh, well, there it is. Yep, that's emotional. Wait, that's some emotion right there. It's emotion." And they're obviously so fucking uncomfortable with it. Just all they can say is, "Well, you gotta, yep." And they're like saying, yes, it's okay in this situation. Your son, after all these years, finally threw his first NFL touchdown. It's okay, Dad. You could be emotional there. But it just sort
Mm.
of, I'm sitting there. This guy can't even like really lend words to this beautiful experience that's happening because he's so goddamn uncomfortable. And Dad's up there trying to hide it.
Mhm.
So, yeah, across the board, I think we're struggling as men.
Mhm.
And again, that's not to say, I'm trying to, I don't know what with male fragility. I'm just saying you can call it that if you want, but it's not helping anything.
Well, and can't we? just stop with all the labels and the othering in some way. Like, you can tell when someone's being authentically vulnerable or emotional. And then when somebody's using that to bypass something or avoid responsibility, I mean, we can be more discerning than that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like, you can hear in couples, like, I want you to be emotionally connected to me. I want to talk about these things. And the minute they show it, your male fragility is here. And it's like, okay, so we have
Seen
a
it.
responsibility to be discerning. Like, what is that? Like, if you feel like your partner is using like false emotionality to
Right.
manipulate you, that
Right.
is one thing. But if your partner's in tears because whatever's going on in their life, like you're sitting there like almost like slapping him in the face for giving you what you've asked for.
Or if
We
they're
can't just
afraid, or if they
sit
are
there.
unhappy, or if they're depressed, right? Like, we're not supposed to show any of that.
No.
Yeah. Mm.
And it's like we have to be more discerning. We have to be more thoughtful, and we have to be more curious. Like, we have a responsibility to, it's not just men that have the responsibility. All of us that aren't men have a responsibility to be more curious and more welcoming.
Mm.
And I'm not saying that there aren't people out there doing harm. And please, can we just understand, we're not speaking in black and white. We're being discerning. But
Mm-hmm.
when someone is showing that, can we welcome them with love?
Mm-hmm.
Can we hold space for them with love? Can we witness them in love?
Well, you said something that was kind of very interesting. You said, that when I show fear, that's when you recognize your reaction to my fear.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a really interesting thing that you did, which is to stop, push, pause, notice that, oh, I have fear about his fear.
Mm-hmm.
And right now it might not be about my fear.
Right. Like, I really just had to track. I remember it started in COVID, I think, because
Well,
COVID was freaky.
yeah. And, and the apocalypse has always been one of those things that I'm like, oh my God. But I think what I've gotten to, and maybe this is quite evident, is that one of the reasons perhaps that men are not afforded those more vulnerable feelings is the feelings that it creates in their counterpart.
Oh, well, I know when you show vulnerability, and like men, it makes them uncomfortable. When you show
Right.
softness, it makes them uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry,
Mm-hmm.
go ahead. You were saying
Well,
something.
just their reaction to that, right? Like, I'm having a reaction to your reaction, and I don't like the reaction in me.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you did so beautifully, I think, is you stopped and you noticed what it brought up in you, and you said, okay, this isn't really about me right now. This is about his fear.
Mm-hmm.
But if you had reacted to my fear, and I mean, usually fear begets anger,
Mm-hmm.
or often, if you had then reacted to my fear and the feelings of fear that created in you in anger, that would have polarized us. I would have lost trust in you.
Yeah, that would have really sucked.
I think it's an interesting piece to talk about later, but we're probably running out of time.
Yeah, we're running out of time, but hope you enjoyed the conversation. We are on YouTube now.
Do we want to talk about like any sort of practical pieces around vulnerability? I think we've just uncovered one that perhaps if you notice that your counterpart, maybe your male counterpart, is experiencing some vulnerability or feelings that are below that bottom pain, so to speak, what is it bringing up in you?
Mm-hmm.
And can you stop and notice, like,
Mm-hmm.
what's happening for you as you notice this, and are you able to make room for that vulnerability? How do you feel about your man's vulnerability?
Well, I mean, it's that mindfulness practice of tracking. Okay, I'm having a reaction in my body to this. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? How do I want to respond?
Mhm,
And again, mindfulness is not exhausting. It's actually so liberating. And that's part of it, is like having that practice of tracking what is happening in this moment between us.
right. And I also love the idea of befriending the self around this. If you're having feelings in this particular case, I guess it doesn't matter, man or a woman, if you're having vulnerable feelings that are making you uncomfortable, personification of those feelings is often really helpful, right?
Mm.
To see them as a part of you,
Mhm.
to recognize that there's a part of me that perhaps there's a little boy in me that's scared shitless,
Yeah.
right? Right. There's a young girl in you that just wants to know that she's safe.
Mhm.
And when we can begin to recognize that that's not the totality of me, there is a younger version of me that is experiencing this, then very often that could be particularly helpful to begin to foster a relationship with that aspect of ourselves through journaling with it, spending time with it, quite literally spending time with it. I know that sounds kind of strange, but in almost every brand of therapy out there, there is a version of working with your parts of self. And
Your
so
shadow parts, those, vulnerabilities in man's shadow often.
that's exactly right. And we want to shove them further down into shadow, and they typically come out sideways. And so I'm encouraging anyone who is doing that currently, look no further than your addictions for your shadow, right? Alcohol's not your problem. Drugs are not your problem. Doom scrolling's not your problem. Those are actually the salve, right? You're trying to salve that wound. You're trying to anesthetize yourself to the vulnerability of those shadow aspects that you talked about. So building a relationship with those parts is a really important step. Being mindful and aware of how it's making you feel, and being able to look at what part of me is coming up around that.
Beautiful.
All right.
Have a peaceful day, whatever you're doing.
That's right. We are on YouTube now, right?
We are on YouTube. Yeah. You can watch us have these conversations.
Don't miss out.
I'm sure that will be thrilling. Okay, we'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye.